А теперь мы переходим в другую часть вообще мира, в Индию, причем помощник редактора известного журнала поможет нам разобраться в украинском кризисе. Его доклад называется «Украинский кризис. Самый крупный европейский конфликт 21 века и выводы Индии из этого конфликта». Господин Каллол, пожалуйста.
Thank you, Chair. I'm of course going to speak about the takeaways for India during the Ukraine crisis. But before that, I'm also going to take you through some of the period that we have passed through during this crisis, some of the early period of this crisis. So, yeah, I don't know if the slides are working here, and if you can see the slides behind me. I had given the slides, if somebody could just upload them. Okay? Yes. Okay. Oh yeah, there's a clicker. So, you know, nobody in India or rather in any part of the world was really ready for the conflict that broke out on 24th of February 2022, and least of all India, because we were in a period of we were caught unprepared. And the initial feeling was that of shock, because Indians were caught in this period of what to do with the almost 20,000 Indians who lived in Ukraine. So the first instance, or the first reflex action for India was to initiate evacuation from Ukraine, leaving aside everything else in the conflict. Of course, India was a friend and remains a friend of Russia, and of course, India had been warm towards Ukraine. But the primary requirement for India at the time, between, say, February to April 2022, was to evacuate those Indian students and business people who were in Ukraine. So that was the first impulse for India, that is to evacuate the Indian students. And once that evacuation was done through this big air operation called Operation Ganga, there came the second phase of this challenge, which was basically the whole realization came to India that the conflict, which was framed as a conflict in Europe, was actually not limited in Europe. It was coming as a tsunami towards India. It was coming as a commodities shock. It was coming as a shock in the form of the market forces that were now hitting India. And we were faced with all sorts of scarcities and inflation of essential commodities. And from diamonds, from Russia, to fertilizer, to agriculture products, to timber, India woke up to the broader impact of the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine war. At the same time, we also understood that a crisis which is happening seemingly, quote unquote, far away in Europe, could also impact India's electoral politics, because India is, after all, a democracy, and we have to somehow proceed from election to election. And it was a realization that if India is not aware and alive to the challenges that such a war posed to India's vital systems, there could also be electoral setbacks for the ruling party, that is the government in Delhi. So there was all these various dimensions of this conflict that was opening up before us. We, of course, took the position, that is, the government of India took the position that it is a European conflict. It is a conflict involving a very friendly nation which has been a time-tested friend of India, that is Russia. And yet it was a conflict in which India wanted to remain absolutely distant. And in this situation of commodities shock, in this situation of the very economic tsunami, the commercial blowback that was coming to India, India had to also come to terms with how to really navigate through this conflict, and to borrow a Chinese phrase, how India could turn this crisis also an opportunity to its advantage. So in this particular context came the idea of reinventing India-Russia commercial ties, and during this time that India's energy supplies from Russia spiked, and bulk of the India-Russia trade that India has traditionally handled only in the form of defense equipment from Russia, here for the first time in decades was going towards the energy supplies from Russia. And it was an unprecedented outcome of this war that nobody had anticipated, that a crisis in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, of course the West as well as the United States, was turning into this enormous economic and commercial challenge for India, which in turn then gave India the opportunity to reinvent its relation with Russia and bring in the energy component in such a major way that energy today is really the main pillar of India-Russia commercial ties. So, so you see this conflict over the last, since 2022 to 25, has been evolving through these various phases when it comes to viewing it from the Indian point of view. And it is in this context that, of course, after this initial shock and the commercial setback and the reinvention of the India-Russia relationship in that volatile context, came the another phase of that conflict, which is the diplomatic initiative for India. And I think that initiative opened up when Prime Minister Modi met President Putin in Samarkand in SCO in September 2022, in which Prime Minister Modi for the first time mentioned that this is not the time for war. So I think it was quite clear from the very beginning that this war is not going to be a predictable conflict, and this war would have many surprises hidden in it. And today, of course, we are sitting here and discussing this conflict, and there is a sense of drama and history all around us because of the obvious global context. We heard the mention of President Donald Trump. Just on the 2nd of April, President Trump has imposed 26% of tariff, reciprocal tariff on India. So the commercial contours of India's diplomatic and commercial engagements with the West is also being re-envisioned in that context. So, and of course, we have in this particular set of circumstances, the upcoming visit of President Putin to India, which will also give India another opportunity to reinvent and move on as this conflict rolls on, though probably in a much lesser intensity. So here I would talk about what's really happening next here, that is the takeaways from the conflict. And the takeaway that's most vital from the Indian point of view is that for a very long time, we viewed Russia as a gentle giant, which was always there to help India. We were viewing Russia as a friend who probably had given up on self-interest. But there was a moment in history when we all remember that there are these turning points in history, and perhaps 2022 February was one such turning point when the world realized, India too realized, that Russia has certain red lines as well, and these red lines are always there, even if Russia not always emphasizes them or reiterates them. It was for the rest of the world to understand that those red lines should be respected. But here was this discovery of Russia, perhaps the rediscovery of Russia from the Indian point of view, where we understood that Russia's security is really paramount, and Russia's security is paramount from its own national point of view. And this particular security, or the security of the Russian self, is very important for maintaining the stability of the world. So I think this was for the first time in perhaps 35 or 34 years that we understood that Russia has something to say, and Russia has been quiet for quite some time. That is, since the decline and disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1990. Another takeaway that we as media professionals understood is that for the first time, that is the Indian media, was reporting conflict in Europe. And I would like to remind the August gathering here that the Indian media has not actually reported conflict in Europe in nearly a century or so, because the last big conflict during the Second World War was not reported for India by Indian journalists. It was reported by Western journalists. And we were essentially dealing with the freedom movement in the 1940s when the Second World War was being fought by Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers. But today we were reporting a European conflict from the Indian point of view. So it was again, a great learning process for many of us in the Indian media, because we were caught between these expressions that this conflict threw up. For example, President Putin, in his opening statement, that early morning speech that all of us watched sitting in Delhi, mentioned that Russia has launched what he described as a special military operation. At the same time, the Western media channels, which are, as you can imagine, very prominent in New Delhi at times, described that war as an aggression and as an attack. So we, as the Indian media, we were caught between this duality, this contradictory description of a conflict. And we had to invent our narrative through quotes and double quotes and dashes and hyphens, so that we could report the conflict in Europe truthfully for our readers and our viewers back in India. It was also a time where the Indian media did a lot of self-introspection, because sometimes we fell short in our initiatives and in our efforts. But overall, I would say that it has been a remarkable experience, because we, as part of the Indian media, we have covered developments in Africa, in Arab Spring, in Southeast Asia, after independence, that is after 1947, this is the first time that we have actually reported a European war involving Russia. And this has been quite a learning process, and I think it tells us the direction that the world is moving. And we have already heard a bit about how the developing world, or the global south, that is India, China, and other such countries, are now giving a new direction to the world. This is my other takeaway from this conflict, is that we understood that there are certain fundamental or foundational principles of Indian diplomacy which have certain time-tested relevance. And when the crunch time arrives, or when we have times of grave conflict and grave serious situation, we rather stick to what is the Indian convention, what are the Indian founding principles. And whether we call it multipolarity or plurilateralism, or perhaps even as going back in time, the 1950s formulation of non-alignment, these are certain factors which should not be given up, because whether we like it or not, India has a population of 1.4 billion in the whole world, of approximately, say, 8 billion or 7 billion or so. And if India can keep out 1.4 billion people of this massive humanity on this planet, then perhaps India can automatically make contribution to, if not solution of a crisis, then perhaps de-escalation of any crisis of global proportion. So I would say that this particular realization came to us soon after the war became intense, during especially the early part of the war, when the emotions were running very high, both in Moscow as well as Kyiv, and very serious debates were taking place in New Delhi during that time. But India kept its focus on non-alignment. India kept its focus on plurilateralism. India kept its focus on what is good for Global South. And I would like to remind the August gathering here that it was at this time that India actually held the summit of the Global South, so as to amplify the requirements of the developing countries of the Global South. Because nothing really is more important than the interest of the Global South, which in fact has the bulk of the global population. And if we have to really ensure stability, then we have to ensure peace in Europe, as much as food supply and supply of essential materials to the countries of the Global South. My very quick points, of course, towards the end, is that the crisis of 2022 till 2025 reminds us of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. In 1956, so we would like to remind ourselves that the Prime Minister of India, that is Jawaharlal Nehru, was also criticized in the similar way for being soft on the Soviet Union. In 1955 December, India hosted the great Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and yet in 1956, when the crisis took place in Hungary, India had to adopt a balanced approach, and India could not really openly support Soviet Union, to some disappointment of Moscow, perhaps at that time. But the fact remained that Jawaharlal Nehru did maintain his balance even in that during that grave conflict, and that sort of a balancing act was followed also during the Suez crisis of 1956. So I think we have a history of balancing during such grave international crisis, and this was one of those institutional memories that were passed down to us. And we also saw it and we experienced it during the Ukraine crisis. My last submission as a takeaway is that that India has been a representative of peace, whether it is Mahatma Gandhi or Lord Buddha, and a traditional emphasis on dialogue, going back to the tradition of Upanishads and the Vedas. We have always emphasized on peace and dialogue to solve some of the intractable problems of our world. But recently, of course, our former Foreign Secretary, Nirupama Rao, wrote in a newspaper article that is it also time for India to play some sort of a peacemaking role in Europe? And by that, the former Foreign Secretary was referring to if it is necessary and if it is essential and if it is agreed upon by all sides to this conflict, since Indians are viewed to be friendly to Russia and friendly to the regional stability and to the idea of regional stability, would the region be open to having Indian support to the peace building and peace enforcement on the ground, if necessary, in the form of a team of people from India as peace negotiators, or even perhaps a peace enforcement regiment? I think these are the ideas that I have as takeaways for India from this conflict, which has actually absorbed us for the last several years. And I really thank you, Chair, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you all for giving me your time. Thank you.